clink, clatter, clink. The sound of loose metal hitting the scratched plexiglass counter of the gas station was deafening. It wasn't the crisp, authoritative snap of a corporate credit card, nor the quiet, dignified rustle of a $50 bill. It was the heavy, chaotic, and deeply humiliating sound of absolute rock bottom. I stood under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the convenience store, my hands trembling as I emptied the contents of my worn canvas pockets. I am 28 years old, but the reflection staring back at me in the anti-theft mirror above the register belonged to a ghost. My skin was pale, my lips chapped from the biting winter wind, and my dark hair was tied back in a messy, defeated knot. I was wearing a faded, oversized parka that I had bought from a thrift store 3 winters ago. It did nothing to stop the bone-deep chill of the December night. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the freezing apathy inside the store. "Pump 4, I said, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. $8, please. The cashier, a young man in his early 20s wearing a blue polo shirt and a name tag that read Gary, didn't immediately reach for the money. Instead, his eyes dropped to the counter. There was no paper currency, just a sprawling, pathetic mountain of loose change. There were pennies sticky with spilled soda, nickels darkened by years of circulating through the bottom of cup holders, and dimes I had literally clawed out from beneath the floor mats of a junkyard just hours earlier. Gary let out a slow, dramatic sigh. He rolled his eyes, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You've got to be kidding me, lady," he muttered, making no effort to lower his voice. "It's almost midnight. You want me to count this?" "It's exactly $8, I replied, swallowing the hard, jagged lump of absolute shame lodged in my throat. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the pile of copper and zinc. I couldn't bear to look at him. I counted it twice. "Yeah, well, I have to count it too," he snapped, aggressively dragging a few quarters toward his side of the counter. Behind me, the automatic doors hissed open, letting in a violent gust of freezing air. A man in a tailored camel hair overcoat stepped into the line. He was holding a bottle of imported sparkling water and a sleek smartphone. I didn't need to turn around to feel the immediate shift in the atmosphere. The man took one look at the pile of coins, glanced at his expensive watch, and let out a sharp, impatient click of his tongue. "Hurry up," the silence in the room screamed at me. "You are an inconvenience, your poverty is in the way." My fingers, numb and stiff from the cold, reached out to help Gary sort the coins. They were stained with black motor oil and rust, the physical evidence of my desperate afternoon. Just 10 hours ago, the landlord had officially changed the locks on our cramped, mold-infested apartment. We were evicted. With exactly $308 to my name, I had 2 choices: spend it all on 3 nights in a sleazy motel and end up on the sidewalk by Thursday, or find a permanent shelter. I had walked 2 miles to a scrap metal yard on the edge of the city. I begged a ruthless cigar-smoking owner to sell me a vehicle that was scheduled to be crushed in the hydraulic press the next morning. I gave him $300 in crumpled bills. It was every paper dollar I owned. In exchange, he gave me the keys to a metal corpse. $1. $1.25? Gary mumbled, his dirty fingernails flicking the coins across the glass. In his haste, his finger caught the edge of a quarter. The coin spun wildly, flew off the edge of the counter, and hit the grimy, tiled floor. It rolled under a display rack of cheap sunglasses. "Oops," Gary said in a flat, unapologetic tone. "You're 25 cents short now." The man in the camel hair coat behind me groaned softly. "For God's sake, just put it on my card," he offered, pulling out a sleek metal credit card. It wasn't an offer of kindness. It was an offer of dismissal. He just wanted the poor woman out of his way. "No," I said instantly. The word shot out of my mouth before I could stop it. "When you have lost your home, your security, and your future, the only currency you have left is your pride." I refused to be a charity case for a man who looked at me like I was a stain on the floor. I dropped to my knees. The floor of the gas station was filthy, covered in muddy footprints and melted road salt. I pressed my hands against the icy tiles, lowering my cheek almost to the ground as I reached my arm entirely under the metal display rack. Dust bunnies and cobwebs clung to my wet sleeve. My fingertips brushed against the cold metal of the quarter. I grabbed it, pulled myself back up to my feet, and placed the coin firmly onto the glass counter. $8, I repeated, my voice no longer a whisper. It was forged from pure, unbreakable iron. "Turn on pump 4. Gary stared at me for a second, perhaps finally registering the dangerous, hollowed-out look in my eyes. He didn't say another word. He just hit a button on his register. The machine beeped, authorizing the pump outside. I didn't wait for a receipt. I turned my back on the cashier and the impatient businessman, shoved my hands deep into the empty pockets of my parka, and walked out through the sliding doors. The moment I stepped out from under the station's canopy, the winter storm assaulted me. The wind howled off the nearby highway, carrying microscopic shards of ice that bit into my exposed cheeks like tiny needles. The temperature was hovering at 12 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill made it feel like 0. I walked across the frozen, oil-stained concrete of the forecourt toward Pump 4. Parked next to the gleaming metal pump was my $300 Salvation. It was a massive 1990s luxury sedan that had been beaten down by decades of neglect. The silver paint was heavily oxidized and peeling off in large, jagged flakes, revealing the brown, cancerous rust eating away at the wheel wells. The rear bumper was severely dented, hanging slightly askew. It looked like a bruised, dying mechanical beast that had dragged itself to the gas station to take its final breath. But it had 4 doors, a roof that didn't leak, and most importantly, a working heater. I stepped up to the vehicle and peered through the rear passenger window. The glass was foggy with condensation, but I could clearly see the small shape huddled in the back seat. Mia, my 5-year-old daughter, was fast asleep. I had bundled her in 2 pairs of sweatpants, a thick woolen sweater, and wrapped her entirely in a faded, star-patterned fleece blanket. Only her small face was visible, her delicate eyelashes resting against her pale cheeks. A tiny rhythmic puff of white vapor escaped her lips with every exhale, indicating just how freezing the interior of the car had become since I turned the engine off. I pressed my freezing hand against the glass. "I am so sorry, baby," I thought, a sudden, violent wave of tears threatening to blur my vision. "I am so sorry." I forced the tears down. Crying wouldn't warm her up. I unhooked the heavy rubber hose from the gas pump, unscrewed the rusted gas cap of the car, and pulled the trigger. The gasoline flowed. I stared blankly at the digital meter on the pump. It spun upward with terrifying speed. $2, $4, $6. Those $8 in coins weren't meant to fill the tank. The tank was massive. It would cost $80 to fill it. I was only buying exactly 2 gallons of regular unleaded gas. 2 gallons was the precise mathematical equation for survival. It was exactly enough fuel to allow me to start the engine and let the car idle for 10 minutes every hour. 10 minutes of the engine running meant 10 minutes of the heater, blowing warm air into the cabin. It was just enough heat to prevent my daughter from freezing to death in her sleep before the sun came up. $8. Click. The pump abruptly shut off. The transaction was over. My pockets were completely empty. I was now entirely devoid of financial resources in a city that charged for everything, including the air you breathed in a heated room. I pulled the nozzle out, securing the gas cap with a dull click. I stood in the freezing wind for a moment, wrapping my arms around my chest, trying to summon the courage to open the heavy metal door and step into my new terrifying reality, living in a junkyard car. As I reached for the frozen door handle, the deep, impenetrable darkness of the gas station entrance was suddenly pierced by a blinding, brilliant light. I squinted, throwing a hand up to shield my eyes. A vehicle was pulling into the station, but it wasn't a traveler looking for cheap coffee, and it certainly wasn't a broken-down relic from a scrapyard. It was a Phantom, a massive, impossibly sleek midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. It glided across the frozen asphalt with the absolute terrifying silence of a predator. The pristine, hand-polished chassis reflected the neon lights of the gas station canopy like a dark mirror. It possessed an aura of such astronomical wealth and untouchable power that it made the very air around it feel heavy. The luxury vehicle rolled smoothly to a stop at the pump directly behind my rusted, peeling sedan. The LED headlights of the Rolls-Royce remained on. The twin beams of brilliant, surgical white light cut through the freezing night, illuminating the entire rear end of my battered car. The light washed over the crushed bumper, the patches of rust, and finally it struck the filthy custom license plate hanging crookedly from the back of my vehicle. I didn't pay any attention to the plate. It was just a random sequence of letters and numbers to me. I quickly opened my car door, desperate to escape the biting wind and the overwhelming presence of the Billionaire's machine, completely unaware that the man sitting behind the tinted acoustic glass of the Rolls-Royce had just stopped breathing. A Rolls-Royce Phantom does not merely transport you, it entombs you in a sanctuary of absolute, untouchable privilege. While the world outside battered itself against the acoustic double-paned glass, a freezing 12-degree December nightmare, the cabin of my vehicle remained a perfectly calibrated 72 degrees. The air was entirely still, carrying the scent of hand-stitched Connolly leather, polished burled walnut, and the 50-year-old Macallan Scotch resting inside the heavy crystal tumbler in my right hand. I was 50 years old. I controlled a global logistics empire, sat on the boards of 3 banks, and possessed a net worth that could buy small island nations. But as I stared blankly out the tinted window at the sterile fluorescent-lit gas station, I knew the absolute, mocking truth of my existence. I was the poorest man on earth. I was a king ruling over an empire of ashes. "Just a quick stop for fuel, Mr. Sterling Marcus," my head of security and driver said from the front seat. His voice was a low, respectful baritone, transmitted through the intercom of the partition. "We'll be back on the highway in 3 minutes. "Take your time, Marcus," I replied, my voice a flat, hollow rasp. "There is nothing waiting for me at home." It had been exactly 7 years. 7 years since the light of my universe was violently extinguished. December always brought the memories clawing back to the surface, dragging me down into the suffocating depths of my own mind. I took a slow, agonizing sip of the scotch, letting the burn of the alcohol momentarily distract me from the phantom ache in my chest. My eyes drifted aimlessly across the frozen forecourt of the gas station. They settled on the vehicle parked at the pump directly in front of us. It was a catastrophic piece of machinery. It was a massive 1990s-era sedan, practically rotting from the inside out. The cheap aftermarket silver paint was peeling off in jagged, leprous strips, revealing advanced, cancerous rust along the wheel arches. The rear bumper hung at a depressed, crooked angle. It was the kind of vehicle that screamed of desperate, inescapable poverty. I watched as a woman emerged from the convenience store. She was thin, frail, wrapped in a faded parka, her shoulders hunched against the biting wind. I watched her pump gas, barely a few seconds of it, just enough to put a splash of fuel into a massive tank. It was the desperate mathematics of the destitute. A fleeting second of objective pity crossed my mind. What a wretched way to exist, I thought, completely detached from her reality. She quickly got into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy rusted door shut. "Unbelievable weather," Marcus muttered, opening his door and stepping out into the freezing wind to operate the pump. As Marcus moved, the Phantom's massive, brilliant LED headlights, which had dimmed to a soft glow, automatically flared to full intensity, sweeping across the dark, frozen concrete. The dual beams of surgical halogen white light struck the rear end of the battered sedan with absolute, unforgiving clarity. The glare washed over the dented trunk, highlighted the peeling silver paint, and finally struck the license plate. It was hanging loosely, secured by only a single rusted screw, covered in a thick layer of dried winter mud and road salt. But the rain and the sleet had washed just enough of the grime away to reveal the stamped, custom lettering. My eyes casually swept over the metal plate. EVL 1976. The world inside the Phantom simply stopped existing. The heavy crystal tumbler slipped from my fingers. It hit the plush, lamb's wool floorboard with a muffled thud. The 50-year-old scotch spilled, pooling into a dark amber stain across the pristine white carpet. I didn't hear it fall. I didn't feel the sudden dampness against my polished leather shoes. My heart seized, a violent physical contraction that completely emptied my lungs of oxygen. My vision tunneled, the edges of my periphery dissolving into absolute blackness until the only thing left in the universe was that sequence of letters and numbers glowing under the headlights. EVL 1976. "No," I choked out. It wasn't a word. It was a desperate, suffocating gasp. "No, it's impossible." The vault of my trauma blew wide open. 7 years ago, Evelyn, my wife, the only woman who had ever looked past the ruthless, calculating billionaire and loved the man underneath. It was a custom plate I had commissioned for her 38th birthday. EVL for Evelyn, 1976 for the year she was born. I had mounted it on a beautifully restored, midnight blue 1998 luxury sedan. The exact make and model of the first car she had ever bought with her own paycheck. She loved that car more than the fleet of exotic supercars sitting in our climate-controlled garage, and she had died for it. It was a rainy Tuesday night. She had stopped at an intersection just 3 miles from our estate. A man had ripped her door open. There was a struggle, a flash of a weapon. The police found her on the wet asphalt, bleeding out. The killer had vanished into the night with the car. But he hadn't just stolen a vehicle. He had stolen my soul. Evelyn always kept a small locked metal lockbox hidden deep inside a custom compartment under the rear passenger seat, a secret space only she and I knew about. Inside that box were our original wedding bands, and a digital voice recorder she used as an audio diary. When she died, the only thing I wanted in the world was to hear her voice one last time, to hold the ring she had placed on my finger. I had deployed a private army of investigators. I spent millions of dollars bribing informants, hacking traffic grids, and tearing apart chop shops across the eastern seaboard. I wanted the car, I wanted the box. Most of all, I wanted the monster who took her, but the car had evaporated like a ghost. The police concluded it had likely been driven straight to a scrapyard, crushed into a cube of metal, and melted down to avoid detection. I had spent 7 years mourning a ghost, and now, sitting in a gas station in the dead of winter, the ghost had materialized directly in front of me. My breathing became jagged, rapid, and shallow. My hands began to tremble with a violent, uncontrollable energy. I leaned forward, pressing my face against the cold, tinted glass. I scrutinized the rotting, silver sedan. The paint is wrong, my analytical mind screamed. It's peeling. But beneath the jagged flakes of cheap silver spray paint, I saw it. Just a microscopic sliver of the original coat, preserved in the deep crease of the trunk line. Midnight blue. It was her car. It was Evelyn's car. The shock instantly metastasized. The crippling, suffocating grief that had defined my life for nearly a decade vanished, completely consumed by an explosion of blinding, white-hot rage. My eyes snapped from the license plate to the driver's seat of the rusted sedan. Through the foggy rear window, I could see the silhouette of the woman who had just pumped the gas. Who is she? My mind, poisoned by years of hatred, calculated the terrifying possibilities. Was she the killer? Unlikely. But was she the killer's wife? His girlfriend? The person he gave the car to after he washed my wife's blood off the steering wheel? To possess that vehicle meant she was connected to the darkest, most horrific night of my existence. She was sitting in the very seat where Evelyn had taken her last breath. A primal, violent roar built up in the back of my throat. I was no longer a civilized man of commerce. I was an apex predator who had just cornered the prey he had been hunting for a decade. "Marcus," I barked. The intercom clicked. "Sir, is everything all right? Do not let that car leave the pump," I commanded, my voice dripping with absolute murderous venom. Before Marcus could even process the order, I grabbed the heavy chrome handle of the Phantom's door. I didn't wait for my security detail. I didn't care about the freezing wind or the danger. I kicked the heavy door open, stepping out of my sanctuary and directly into the icy teeth of the winter storm. The wind hit me, but I didn't feel the cold. I only felt the burning, raging inferno in my blood. I marched toward the rusted silver sedan, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles were bone white. Every step was fueled by 7 years of nightmares. I was going to tear the door off its hinges. I was going to drag whoever was inside out onto the freezing concrete, and I was going to make them answer for my dead wife. I reached the trunk of the car. I passed the EVL 1976 plate. I stepped up to the driver's side window, raised my fist and slammed it directly into the glass. Bang. The sound of my knuckles slamming against the frozen driver's side window was a violent, percussive crack that rivaled the howling wind. A sharp jolt of pain shot up my forearm, but it was entirely swallowed by the blinding, white-hot inferno of my rage. "Open the door!" I roared, my voice a brutal, unrecognizable snarl that tore through the freezing December air. I grabbed the rusted chrome door handle and yanked it upward with enough force to warp the metal, but the heavy locking mechanism held firm. I pounded my fist against the glass again, leaving a smear of my own blood on the frost-covered window. I was no longer Elias Sterling, the sophisticated titan of global logistics. I was a wounded, dangerous animal, standing inches away from the metal cage that held the answers to my 7-year nightmare. The civilized veneer I had worn for 50 years completely disintegrated, leaving only the raw, bleeding core of a husband who had been robbed of his universe. "Get out of the car!" I screamed, slamming the flat of my palm against the roof. Behind me, the heavy doors of the Rolls-Royce flew open. Marcus and another security operative, Thomas, sprinted across the icy concrete. They were highly trained professionals, accustomed to extracting me from hostile environments, but they instantly recognized that tonight I was the hostile environment. "Mr. Sterling." "Sir, step back," Marcus yelled, his massive frame closing the distance. He reached out to grab my shoulder, attempting to pull me away from the rusted vehicle. "Do not touch me, Marcus," I snarled, violently shoving his arm away. I pointed a trembling, manic finger at the peeling silver paint. "Block the exits. Do not let this vehicle leave the pump. If she tries to start the engine, shoot out the tires. Do you understand me?" Marcus blinked, deeply alarmed by the absolute unhinged savagery in my eyes, but he was a soldier. He gave a sharp nod, moving to position himself directly in front of the battered sedan's hood, his hand resting instinctively on the holster beneath his jacket. I turned back to the window. Inside the dim, fogged-up cabin, the scene was one of absolute primal panic. The woman in the faded parka had scrambled backward the second my fist hit the glass. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She wasn't trying to start the car. Instead, she threw her entire upper body over the gap between the front seats, diving into the rear of the cabin. Through the smudged glass, I saw exactly what she was doing. She was spreading her arms wide, using her own frail, shivering body as a human shield over a small lump huddled beneath a star-patterned fleece blanket. The little girl, who couldn't have been older than 5, had woken up. I could see her small, terrified face peering out from under the blanket, her mouth open in a silent scream. A family, my poisoned mind hissed. The killer has a family. He gets to watch his child sleep while my wife rots in the ground. Open this door right now, or I will authorize my men to shatter the glass, I bellowed, pressing my face entirely against the icy window. The woman inside froze. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto mine through the pane of glass. I expected to see the hardened, calculating gaze of a criminal. I expected defiance. Instead, I saw a terror so profound, so astronomically deep, it practically radiated through the metal door. Her lips were trembling violently. Her face was deathly pale. With agonizing slowness, she raised her right hand, her fingers stained with black motor oil, and pressed a button on the door console. The window rolled down exactly 2 inches. Just enough to let the freezing wind howl into the cabin, but not enough for me to reach inside. "Please," she sobbed, her voice a ragged, desperate plea that cracked under the weight of her fear. "Please, mister, I don't have any money. I have $8 of gas in this car and that's it. Take my coat, take whatever you want, just don't hurt my baby. Please God, don't hurt Mia." Her words didn't register in my grief-blinded brain. I didn't care about her money. I didn't care about her coat. "Where is he?" I demanded, gripping the top edge of the rolled-down glass, uncaring that the sharp rim was cutting into my palms. The woman blinked, her tears spilling over her eyelashes, completely confused. "Who?" "The man who gave you this car." I roared, the volume of my voice making the little girl in the back seat shriek in terror. "The monster who owns this vehicle. Where is he hiding? Tell me his name, or so help me God, I will tear this piece of junk apart with my bare hands." "Nobody gave it to me," she screamed back, the maternal instinct to protect her child suddenly overriding her paralysis. "I don't know who you're talking about. There is no man, it's just me and my daughter. You're lying." I spat, my vision swimming with red. "This is a custom vehicle. It belonged to my wife. The man who stole it murdered her in cold blood 7 years ago. So you are going to tell me exactly how you got the keys to this car, or my security team is going to drag you out of it." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. The absolute absurdity and horror of my words seemed to short-circuit her panic. "Murdered," she whispered, her eyes widening in sheer disbelief. "Mister, you're crazy. I'm not a criminal. I didn't steal anything." "Then explain the car," I demanded, the veins in my neck bulging. "I bought it." She cried out hysterically, her freezing, oil-stained hands frantically digging into the deep pockets of her faded parka. "I bought it 4 hours ago. I have the paper. I have the paper." Her trembling hand shot out through the 2-inch gap in the window. She shoved a crumpled, filthy, oil-stained piece of paper directly into my chest. I snatched it out of her grip, stepping back from the door. I was breathing heavily, the adrenaline pumping so fiercely my vision was vibrating. I held the crumpled paper up, turning it toward the harsh, glaring lights of the gas station canopy. It was a standard carbon copy receipt. The paper was cheap, yellowed, and smelled heavily of industrial solvent and stale cigar smoke. At the top, stamped in faded blue ink, were the words, "Ulri Salvage and Scrapyard, Brooklyn." My eyes darted down the page, scanning the chaotic handwritten scrawl. Date, 4:15 p.m. Item 1998 sedan. No title. Sold AS. Status, scheduled for hydraulic crush. Paid $300. Zero cash. At the very bottom, in bold red block letters, the scrapyard owner had stamped, "Vile as scrap metal. Not safe for road." I stood completely still. The freezing winter wind howled across the concrete, whipping my expensive wool coat around my legs, but I felt absolutely nothing. The universe, which had been spinning out of control in a hurricane of vengeance, suddenly ground to a horrifying, sickening halt. 4 hours ago, she hadn't stolen the car. She hadn't harbored a murderer. She had literally pulled a rotting metal corpse out of a junkyard crusher a few hours before I saw her. Slowly, agonizingly, I lowered the receipt. I looked back at the car, but this time the blinding red veil of my fury had lifted. I wasn't looking at my wife's murder scene anymore. For the first time, I actually looked at the reality sitting in front of me. I looked through the window. I saw the dashboard. The heater vents were broken, rattling pathetically as they struggled to push out even a breath of warm air. I saw the passenger seat, littered with a few cheap plastic grocery bags containing a loaf of discounted bread and a jar of peanut butter. I saw a pair of women's canvas sneakers on the floorboard, shoes that were completely soaked through with freezing slush, and then my eyes shifted to the back seat. The little girl, Mia, was crying silently, her tiny hands clutching her mother's parka. Beside her was a stuffed bear with a missing eye, heavily worn from years of being loved. The child's lips were faintly blue from the cold. "We were evicted this morning," the mother whispered through the crack in the window. Her voice was completely broken, completely devoid of pride. It was the sound of a human being who had been crushed by the weight of the world. I had $300, the shelters were full. It was either buy this piece of junk from the scrapyard to sleep in, or my baby freezes to death on a park bench. She looked at my tailored suit. She looked at the diamond-encrusted watch on my wrist. Then she looked at the blood on my knuckles. "I don't know who your wife was, mister," she sobbed, burying her face into her daughter's hair. "I'm sorry she died, but I didn't hurt her. I'm just a mother trying to keep her kid alive until morning. Please, if this car means that much to you, take it. Just let us get our blankets. We'll walk. Just let us go." The words struck me with the force of a freight train. Take it. Just let us get our blankets. We'll walk. A profound, suffocating wave of realization crashed over me, completely annihilating my rage. The fury evaporated, leaving behind a cold, terrifying emptiness in my chest. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. My knuckles were bleeding from striking the glass of a freezing, homeless woman's only sanctuary. I had spent 7 years hunting a monster. I had spent thousands of sleepless nights praying for the opportunity to confront the evil that had destroyed my life. I had promised Evelyn's memory that I would be the sword of justice. But standing in the freezing rain, looking at the terrified, shivering 5-year-old girl and her desperately poor mother, I realized the most horrifying truth of all. Tonight, I was the monster. I was a man who possessed limitless power, unimaginable wealth, and total security, and I had just used all of it to terrorize a destitute, freezing single mother who had bought a rusted metal box just to keep her child's heart beating through the night. I had battered her door, screamed in her face, and threatened to leave her on the street in a 12-degree blizzard. My wealth, my power, my righteous vengeance, it was all suddenly repulsive to me. "Oh God," I breathed, the words barely escaping my throat. The scotch in my stomach turned to acid. The shame was absolute, a crushing physical weight that forced my shoulders to drop. I took a slow, unsteady step backward, creating space between myself and the driver's side door. Marcus, seeing the violent tension completely drain from my posture, cautiously stepped away from the hood of the car. "Mr. Sterling?" he asked quietly, confused by the sudden dramatic shift in my demeanor. I raised a trembling hand, signaling my security detail to stand down. I couldn't look Marcus in the eye. I couldn't look at Thomas. I was entirely consumed by my own disgrace. I turned my gaze back to the 2-inch crack in the window. Clara was still shielding her daughter, watching me with the wide, traumatized eyes of a wounded animal waiting for the final blow. I started, but my voice broke. The commanding, authoritative baritone of the Billionaire CEO was gone. "I am so deeply, deeply sorry." Clara didn't respond. She just tightened her grip on her daughter. "I made a mistake," I whispered, the freezing wind whipping the tears from my eyes before they could even fall. "A terrible, unforgivable mistake. Please, please do not get out of the car. Please keep the doors locked. You are safe from me. I swear to you on my life you are safe." I looked at the crumpled, oil-stained scrapyard receipt still clutched in my hand. This woman had saved the car from being crushed into a cube of useless steel. She had inadvertently rescued the only physical connection I had left to my dead wife. The ghost of Highway 9 hadn't returned to torment me. The ghost had returned because Evelyn, even in death, knew exactly where to send the car. She had sent it to a mother who needed a miracle, and to a husband who needed to remember what grace looked like. I looked up at the rusted, peeling door of the sedan. I knew what was hidden inside it. "Miss," I said, my voice dropping to a gentle, pleading register. "My name is Elias Sterling, and I need to ask you for a favor that might change both of our lives." The silence that followed my apology was heavier than the freezing December wind. I stood inches away from the rusted, peeling door of the 1998 sedan, my bleeding knuckles resting weakly against my side. I was a man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, who moved millions of dollars with a signature. Yet in this desolate gas station, I was entirely at the mercy of a destitute, terrified mother. A favor? Clara stammered through the 2-inch gap in the window. Her voice was still trembling, her arms wrapped fiercely around her little girl. What do you mean? I took a slow, deep breath. The freezing air burned my lungs, but the physical pain grounded me. 7 years ago, I began, my voice stripped of all its baritone authority, leaving only the ragged edges of a broken husband. My wife Evelyn was driving this exact car. She loved it. She was stopped at a traffic light just a few miles from here. A man dragged her out. He took the car and he left her on the asphalt. Clara's breath hitched. Her dark eyes, previously wide with terror, suddenly softened with the universal devastating recognition of profound loss. She didn't survive, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. For 7 years I have searched for this vehicle. Not for the metal, not for the engine. But because my wife had a secret compartment built into the frame beneath the rear passenger seat. It was our hiding place. And she kept something inside it. Something I have been desperately trying to recover since the night she died. I looked directly into Clara's eyes. I didn't see a vagrant. I saw a mother who understood the lengths a person would go to for the people they loved. I bought the junkyard receipt, I said gently, pointing to the crumpled paper in my hand. You saved this car from being crushed into a cube of steel this afternoon. You saved the only piece of her I have left. I am asking you as a man begging for his life. Please, let me look under the seat. Clara stared at me. She looked at the blood on my hand. She looked past me, at the massive, imposing figure of Marcus and the midnight black Rolls-Royce, idling like a dormant beast. She could have demanded money right then. She could have leveraged my desperation for a blank check. Instead, she simply looked down at Mia, kissed the top of her daughter's head, and nodded. Click. The heavy, rusted locks of the sedan disengaged. Clara pushed the driver's door open. She stepped out into the biting wind, immediately wrapping her faded parka tightly around the little girl in her arms. Mia buried her face into her mother's neck, shivering violently. Marcus, I called out, my voice returning to a steady, operational cadence but devoid of its former cruelty. Open the doors of the Phantom. Turn the heat up to 80 degrees. Get them inside and bring every blanket we have in the trunk. Marcus didn't hesitate. Right away, Mr. Sterling. Clara hesitated, looking at the impossibly luxurious interior of the Rolls-Royce, then down at her slush-soaked canvas sneakers. I'll ruin the carpet, she whispered, shivering uncontrollably. Miss, I said, looking her dead in the eye, if you and your daughter want to track mud across the roof of that car, I will gladly hand you the ladder. Please, get in where it's warm. Guided by Marcus, Clara and Mia hurried toward the Phantom. I turned my attention to the open door of the rusted sedan. The interior smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp mildew, and the metallic tang of old rust. It was a decaying tomb. I reached inside, feeling the brittle, cracked leather of the driver's seat. I climbed into the back. It was a tight, suffocating space. My bespoke, tailored suit pressed against the filthy floorboards. I didn't care. I wedged my knees against the back of the front seats and dug my hands into the seam where the rear bench met the floor pan. Evelyn had showed me the release mechanism a decade ago. Push down, slide left, pull up. Her voice echoed in my memory, bright and full of life. My fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled blindly in the dark crevice. The foam of the seat had rotted, crumbling into a sticky powder under my touch. I felt a sharp piece of exposed metal wire slice into my index finger, adding fresh blood to my already bruised knuckles. I ignored it. Push down, slide left, pull up, clack. The heavy metal latch groaned in protest, fighting against 7 years of rust and neglect, but it finally gave way. The entire lower cushion of the rear seat popped upward. I grabbed the heavy cushion and violently ripped it out of the car, tossing it out the open door onto the frozen concrete. Underneath, in the raw, exposed steel belly of the chassis, was a small rectangular panel locked in place by a combination dial. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the tiny metal dials. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe. Our anniversary. I spun the dials. 1, 0, 1, 4. There was a soft metallic click. I wedged my bleeding fingernails under the edge of the panel and pulled. It swung open, revealing a dark, dust-free cavity. Sitting in the exact center of the compartment, untouched by time, scrap yards, or the freezing winter storms, was a small, heavy steel lockbox. I pulled it out. It was cold to the touch. It was no larger than a hardcover book, but as I held it in my hands, it felt heavier than my entire corporate empire. I knelt there in the decaying shell of the sedan, clutching the dirty metal box to my chest, and I let out a jagged, suffocating breath that had been trapped in my lungs for 7 years. I slowly backed out of the car. The The freezing wind hit my face, but the cold was a distant, irrelevant sensation. I walked across the concrete, moving like a man in a trance, toward the open door of the Rolls-Royce. Inside, the contrast was jarring. The cabin was sweltering, lit by the soft, golden ambient lighting of the luxury vehicle. Clara and Mia were huddled together on the pristine white leather seats, wrapped entirely in thick cashmere emergency blankets. Mia had stopped crying. The immediate, overwhelming warmth of the car had lulled her into a state of exhausted daze. I sat down in the seat opposite them. I didn't close the door. I needed the freezing air to keep me tethered to reality. I placed the steel box on the burled walnut center console. Clara watched me, her dark eyes reflecting the amber light of the cabin. She recognized the profound reverence with which I handled the object. "Is that it?" she asked softly. "Yes," I whispered. The box didn't have a lock. It was secured by a heavy brass clasp. I unhooked it and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red velvet, were two objects. The first was a platinum wedding band, my original ring. I had lost weight in the months after her death and had taken it off to be resized. But I had never gotten around to it. She had placed it in the box for safekeeping. The second object was a small silver digital voice recorder. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Evelyn had a habit of leaving me voice memos when she traveled. Mundane, beautiful little updates about her day, the books she was reading, the things she wanted to tell me when I was too busy in boardrooms to pick up the phone. But this recorder was different. The police had told me that based on the forensic evidence, Evelyn had been trapped in the car for several minutes, fists while the assailant tried to break the window. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty what this recording was. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely audible, "patch the auxiliary audio through the car's sound system." Marcus reached over from the front seat, quietly plugging a sleek auxiliary cord into the bottom of the digital recorder. He nodded respectfully, turning his face away to give me privacy. I looked at Clara. "You don't have to stay for this," I offered, knowing how heavy this moment was about to be. "I'm not leaving you alone," Clara said firmly, her maternal instinct extending to the broken man sitting across from her. I swallowed hard. My trembling, blood-stained finger reached out and pressed the play button. For a moment, there was only the hiss of static pouring through the Phantom's 18-speaker surround sound system. Then the static was broken by the sound of heavy, frantic breathing. Elia's. The voice filled the cabin. It was her. It was Evelyn. The sound of her voice, the rich, warm, melodic tone I had played in my head every single night for 7 years, was suddenly real. It was right there in the car with me. The sound of my own sob violently tore itself from my throat. I covered my mouth with my hand, squeezing my eyes shut. In the recording there was a loud, terrifying thud in the background, the sound of someone striking the car window. "Elias, listen to me," Evelyn's recorded voice said. She was terrified, her breath hitching, but underneath the panic there was a fierce, desperate clarity. "There's a man outside the car. He has a gun. He's trying to break the glass. I've called the police, but they aren't going to make it." Thud, crack. "I don't have much time," she cried, her voice breaking. "I need you to hear this. If I don't make it, Elias, if I don't come home, you have to listen to me." I leaned forward, my forehead resting almost against my knees, weeping uncontrollably. Clara reached across the console, her warm, calloused hand gently gripping my shoulder. "You are going to be angry," Evelyn's voice continued, crackling through the speakers. "You are going to want to tear the world apart to find whoever did this. But you can't. Please, Elias. Do not let the hatred consume you. You spent your whole life building fortresses. Don't build one out of vengeance. It will kill the man I love." Another loud smash echoed on the tape, the sound of safety glass fracturing. "Promise me," she sobbed, the sound of her tears breaking my heart all over again. "Promise me you'll find a way to forgive the world. Promise me you will use your life to protect people, not to punish them. I love you, Elias. I love you so moo." The recording cut off abruptly with the deafening sound of shattering glass. Then, absolute silence. The playback ended. The digital screen on the recorder went dark. I sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce, completely paralyzed. The words echoed in the sweltering cabin, bouncing off the acoustic glass, drilling directly into the darkest, most corrupted corners of my soul. "Don't let the hatred consume you. Promise me you will use your life to protect people, not to punish them." I slowly lifted my head. I looked out the open door of the Phantom, past the neon lights of the canopy, toward the rusted peeling silver sedan parked at the pump. 10 minutes ago, I had slammed my fists against that car. I had screamed in the face of a freezing mother. I had used my power to terrorize a child. I had become the exact monster Evelyn had used her dying breath to beg me not to be. I had failed her. I had spent 7 years failing her. I let out a raw, agonizing cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief and crushing shame. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing with the violent, unrestrained intensity of a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered. I felt a sudden movement. Clara had slipped off her seat. She knelt on the floorboard of the Phantom right in front of me. She didn't say a word. She simply reached out and wrapped her arms around my shaking shoulders, pulling me into a fierce, comforting embrace. She was a woman who had nothing. She had been evicted, humiliated, and driven to the absolute edge of human endurance. Yet, in the presence of my astronomical wealth, she was the one offering me sanctuary. She was doing exactly what Evelyn had asked of me, protecting, not punishing. I wept into the shoulder of her faded parka, the smell of cheap thrift store cotton and freezing rain grounding me back into reality. When the tears finally subsided, leaving me hollowed out but inexplicably lighter, I slowly pulled back. I looked at Clara. Her own face was streaked with tears, her dark eyes shining with a profound, quiet strength. "She sounded like a beautiful soul," Clara whispered. "She was," I replied, my voice raspy, wiping the tears from my jaw. "And she was right. I let the anger turn me into something I despise." I looked over at the rusted sedan. The engine was dead, the heater was broken. It was a metal death trap disguised as a life raft. I looked back at Clara. I saw the cheap, waterlogged canvas sneakers on her feet. I saw the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of her face. The anger was gone. The vengeance had evaporated. What remained was a crystal-clear, absolute certainty of what I had to do. "Clara," I said, my voice steadying, the billionaire returning to the surface. But this time not as a predator, but as a protector. "How much did you say you paid for that car? How much did you say you paid for that car?" I asked, my voice steady, but carrying a shift in its foundation. Clara looked at me, her eyes still red from the tears we had just shared. She glanced out the window at the rusted, battered silver sedan sitting under the harsh fluorescent canopy. $300, she answered quietly, her voice laced with the exhaustion of a woman who had fought an unwinnable war. "It was every single dollar I had in the world. The landlord locked us out this morning. I didn't have enough for first and last month's rent anywhere else. I just needed a metal box to keep the wind off my baby." I looked down at the yellowed, oil-stained scrapyard receipt still resting on my knee. My eyes locked onto the red, stamped letters at the bottom of the page. "Scheduled for hydraulic crush. O'Leary's salvage," I murmured, the terrifying reality of the timeline suddenly crystallizing in my mind. "I know that yard. My logistics company bought the industrial park next to it. They run their hydraulic presses at 6 o'clock every morning. If a car doesn't have a title, they crush it into a cube and melt it down for rebar." Clara nodded slowly. "The owner told me I was lucky. He said if I had shown up 10 minutes later, he would have drained the fluids and put it on the conveyor belt for the morning shift." A cold shudder, completely unrelated to the winter storm outside, violently rippled down my spine. I looked at the heavy steel lockbox resting on the burled walnut console. I looked at the platinum wedding band and the small silver voice recorder that held the final desperate heartbeat of my wife's soul. If Clara had given up, if she had decided to spend her last $300 on a cheap motel room for a few nights of comfort, if she had been 10 minutes later, by sunrise tomorrow, Evelyn's voice would have been annihilated. The ring would have been melted into industrial slag. The only piece of grace I had left in the world would have been erased from existence, and I would have spent the rest of my life consumed by a rotting, venomous hatred. Clara hadn't just bought a car. She had intercepted a tragedy. She had reached into the jaws of a crushing machine and unknowingly pulled my salvation out of the metal shredder. I looked at her. Really looked at her. I remembered watching her inside the convenience store just 15 minutes ago. I remembered the impatient wealthy man in the camel hair coat trying to pay for her gas, treating her like a nuisance. I remembered the absolute, unbreakable pride in her eyes as she dropped to her knees on a filthy, muddy floor just to find a single dropped quarter so she wouldn't owe anyone a dime. I was a billionaire. I could write a check right now that would buy her an estate in the Hamptons. But I knew that if I handed this woman a blank check out of pity, it would be an insult. It would be charity. And a woman who counted pennies with bleeding hands to keep her daughter alive did not need charity. She needed dignity. "Clara," I said, my posture straightening. The broken, weeping man retreated and the CEO returned. But the ruthlessness was gone, entirely replaced by a profound, unwavering respect. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" That vehicle out there is your legal property, I stated, gesturing toward the rusted sedan. You purchased it. You possess the bill of sale. That means you have the absolute right to do whatever you want with it. Clara frowned, clearly confused by the sudden shift to business terminology. Mr. Sterling, you don't have to worry. I told you if it means that much to you, you can take it. I don't want it. I'll just take our blankets and we'll figure it out. No, I interjected, my voice firm and absolute. I do not take handouts, and I know for a fact that you do not take them either. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a sleek, leather-bound checkbook and a platinum fountain pen. I am a venture capitalist, Clara, I explained, clicking the pen open. I buy and sell assets. I evaluate the worth of an item based on the value it brings to my life. And right now, that 1998 silver sedan sitting at pump 4 is the single most valuable piece of machinery on the face of the earth. I flattened the checkbook against the leather armrest. I am officially offering to purchase your vehicle, I said, my eyes locking onto hers. I want the chassis. I want the rusted doors. I want the broken heater. I want every single molecule of it. And my opening offer is $1 million. Clara stopped breathing. The silence in the sweltering cabin was absolute. Even the howling wind outside seemed to pause. She stared at me, her mouth slightly parted, her dark eyes entirely devoid of comprehension. She looked at the checkbook, then back at my face, waiting for the cruel punchline, waiting for the rich man to reveal the joke. You're making fun of me, she whispered, her voice cracking, a defensive wall immediately snapping up to protect her fragile heart. I have never been more serious in my 50 years of existence, I replied, the platinum nib of my pen gliding across the watermarked paper. I wrote the date, I wrote her name, and then I wrote out the zeros, 6 of them, Mr. Sterling. It's a piece of junk, she stammered, panic lacing her words. It's worth $300. You can't just. To O'Leary's salvage yard it is worth $300, I corrected gently. Because they only value the weight of the steel. But to me it holds my wife's memory, it holds my absolution. You set the market price when you bought it, Clara. And I am willing to pay a premium to acquire it. I tore the check from the binding. I didn't hand it to her. I placed it gently on the center console right next to the steel lockbox. But the car is only the first part of my offer, I continued, leaning forward. Clara's eyes were glued to the check. $1 million. It was a sum of money so vast, so entirely alien to her reality that her brain simply couldn't process it. She instinctively pulled Mia closer to her chest. 7 years ago, before she died, my wife started the Evelyn Sterling Foundation, I said, my voice softening as I spoke her name. It was a charitable trust designed to build emergency housing for single mothers. When she was murdered, I locked the foundation away. I handed it over to a board of corporate directors who only cared about tax write-offs. I let her dream die because I was too blinded by my own grief. I looked at the oil stains on Clara's freezing hands. Those directors sit in glass towers, I said. They don't know what it feels like to count pennies at midnight. They don't know the terror of a 12-degree winter wind. They don't know what it takes to protect a child when the entire world has turned its back on you. I pointed to the digital voice recorder. Evelyn told me to protect people, to not let the hatred win. But I don't know how to do that anymore. I forgot how. I looked deeply into Clara's tear-streaked face. You haven't forgotten. You threw your body over your daughter when you thought a monster was breaking through your window. You offered to let me take the car, despite knowing it meant you would freeze on the street, just to show me kindness. I took a deep breath. I am officially offering you the position of executive director of the Evelyn Sterling Foundation, I stated. You will have a staff, an office, and a multi-million-dollar endowment. Your job will be to scour this city and find every single mother sleeping in a car, every family locked out in the cold, and you will buy them a home. You will do for them exactly what you did for my wife's memory today. You will save them from the crusher. Clara's lower lip trembled violently. The defensive wall she had spent years building, the ironclad armor of poverty that kept her moving through the humiliation, the starvation, and the endless, crushing despair, finally completely shattered. She didn't try to speak. She couldn't. She reached out with a shaking hand and picked up the check. She looked at the numbers. She looked at her sleeping daughter's face, peaceful and warm under the cashmere blanket. For the first time in her adult life, the terrifying, suffocating math of survival, the calculation of gallons of gas, the price of cheap bread, the cost of a motel room, evaporated. The math was gone. The war was over. Clara pressed the check to her chest, buried her face in her free hand, and wept. It wasn't the quiet, suppressed crying of a woman trying to hide her pain. It was a loud, visceral, and incredibly beautiful sound. It was the sound of a human soul breaking out of a cage. I didn't stop her. I let her cry until the exhaustion finally claimed her. "Marcus," I called out softly over the intercom. "Yes, Mr. Sterling? Call our private towing service. Tell them to send a flatbed to this location immediately," I instructed. "Tell them they are picking up a 1998 silver sedan. I want it strapped down with microfiber straps. I want it handled with the exact same protocol we use to transport the vintage Ferraris. It goes straight to the climate-controlled vault at the estate." "Understood, sir," Marcus replied. "And Marcus?" "Sir, put the car in drive," I said, leaning back into the plush leather seat, feeling a profound, unfamiliar warmth spreading through my chest. "We are taking our new executive director and her daughter home." The drive back to the estate was silent, save for the soft hum of the Phantom's V12 engine and the rhythmic breathing of Clara and Mia, who had both fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on the back seat. I sat opposite them, watching the dark, frozen city blur past the window. My hand rested gently on the steel lockbox beside me. For 7 years I had believed that wealth was a weapon. I had used it to insulate myself, to hunt and to punish. But tonight, a woman with $8 in pennies had taught me the ultimate truth. Money cannot buy a soul. It cannot negotiate with grief. And it certainly cannot purchase absolution. But if you are very, very lucky, and if you are willing to let go of your hatred, money can buy a miracle. The Phantom crested the hill leading toward my estate. In the distance, the heavy, suffocating storm clouds were finally beginning to fracture. A thin, brilliant line of golden sunlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the horizon. The ghost of my past had finally been laid to rest. And for the first time in a decade, I wasn't dreading the morning. I was ready to protect the light.